Hi, everybody. I'm just giving this a few minutes. We don't really have a start time till for another minute, but because we have such a large registration list today, I opened it a little early so our audience can build. Sit tight and we'll get rolling on time, we hope, and ensure everybody gets a chance to come in. Okay, it is noon. I will start a little slowly because we do have a really large interest in today's webinar, which is really exciting for us. I think it might be one of our largest registrations to date. Don't hold me to that. I haven't actually looked at the data. Nonetheless, the interest is high. I am Renee Strummy, and I'm the training specialist here with the Minnesota Elder Justice Center. I'm really grateful to see such interest and the growth of our webinars continue along the road here. Today, we're talking about concepts in capacity. This is an introduction that Marit will lead us through. And today is October 13th, 2022. And you've found us here. We're the Minnesota Elder Justice Center. We're a statewide organization. You can see our mission statement here. We mobilize communities to prevent and alleviate abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation of older and vulnerable adults. We have been working on this work through public awareness, professional education, and that's a little of both that you're participating in today, public policy, and direct services. And I always want to take a moment to ensure you know how to reach our victim services advocate. This is the phone number to call. That's 651-440-9312. There's also a form you can fill out on our website just under victim services or find help. There's a couple of routes that you can find this form. It's important to know that we are a helpline, and our advocates are here to kind of help navigate systems, provide support and systems advocacy in ways that they can. We are not a 24-hour hotline. We are not the official reporting of abuse, elder abuse either, but we are absolutely there for personal, professional, and family member sort of resources there. So whomever you might be, you're welcome to reach out as a starting point to understand and kind of maybe case consult, talk about what's going on in your family, those kinds of things. We also, as you know, because you're here, we have these Thursday webinars. We have them almost weekly. You can see the list of what's coming up within the month. I do have it scheduled out actually through the whole year. We just don't necessarily have them posted or ready for registration. We are taking a break on November 10th because we are having our annual breakfast fundraiser. So if you're able to make that, or if you're unable but still want to provide support for this work, we really welcome that as well. You will always be able to find those webinars on our website under elderjusticemn.org/webinars. Not all of these will be up there yet, certainly not the ones that I have planned through December, but they will be coming forth. These are always free. We love to keep them free, and more on that in a bit. We also are able to offer CEUs. Now, we're pre-approved for social work and for BELTS, which is long-term services. And the certificate that we send out after this is over will contain the numbers for those pre-approved for social work and BELTS. But anybody else is free to use that to self-submit within their own licensing agency. Today is a webinar format through Zoom, and that means you're all muted. We can't see your camera, so you're free to kind of watch wherever you are. But we also really want your participation. Your questions, your feedback, your ideas are completely embraced by us. we do ask that you consider using that Q&A box for those speaker questions. It's just a lot easier for us to chat or to track and see what's been answered and what hasn't been answered. The chat, you can share resources with each other or ideas or talk about whatever is out there, problem solve, but it can get lost within there, and you may end up your question might not be seen if you use the chat box for questions. That's the whole thing. We do have this set up for auto-generated captioning, and that's available under live transcript. You can toggle that on and off as suits your need. So attention to that. As I said, that CEU and the certificate of attendance will be emailed out to you along with a slide deck that is that Marit is using here and that we're using right now. We also are recording this. And this will be posted on our website. We have a video library. You can look back. I kind of keep a year's worth of those videos up. So you can kind of check back and see what's going on, share it with whomever. It will be point out that we are unable to grant CEUs for watching recorded videos. We have to keep a record of who has seen it and for how long they've watched for these licensing agencies. So those are for reference only and useful, and I hope that you see them, but we aren't able to provide CEUs for that. And then, of course, I want to mention that we really, really welcome your feedback, and a survey will pop up after this is over, and really hope that you take the time to provide that feedback and give us ideas of what more you want to hear. These are your back and forth communication with us is really what helps keep our content relevant and useful to all of you. And then finally, we do provide these webinars at no cost to you, and we want to keep those free, and we have no obligation. Nobody's obligated to provide any support, but if you're willing to and able to give a gift to help keep these resources available across the state country, actually, we have donations are gladly accepted and encouraged. And you can find us under the GiveMN portal, and we're under the Minnesota Elder Justice Center. And now I'm going to turn it over to Marit Peterson, who is really keyed in to provide this information. I will mute and stop my video now, Marit.
Thank you so much, Renee. I appreciate it a lot. And welcome, everybody. I am really thrilled to hear of the number of registrants and to see folks as they're arriving at the webinar. I want to just take a moment to thank you so much for joining us, and also to thank you for your own work in this field. I'm just really, really grateful for the interest here and for the energy around engaging in this discussion. I'm Marit Peterson. I'm the Associate Director at the Minnesota Elder Justice Center, and I'll get started on our agenda for the day. As Renee said, please feel free to engage with us, messages in the chat, questions in the Q&A window, and Renee will help me as I present the content to identify Q&A that's coming in that's really relevant to the immediate discussion, and then hopefully we'll have a time to explore questions at the end of the presentation as well. If for any reason we are not able to answer a question that you have, we will be able to acknowledge those questions, or I can review those questions at the end. But I just want to encourage you to reach out to me as well, and I'll do my best to make sure that I can get any questions that might arise and that we don't have a chance to address during the webinar later on when I can review. So today's agenda, we're talking about the meaning of capacity. I called this Concepts in Capacity an Introduction, and I really do want to emphasize that. I know many of you are working in the field, and many of you are probably deep in this realm of decision-making and assessment of decision-making and thinking about capacity in various ways. I'm sure that discussions about capacity impact both you and the folks you serve, whether they're clients or participants or members or residents. the discussions of capacity are impacting you in your professional life. But what I want to do today is just take a little step back and look at the concepts surrounding capacity, what we're really attempting to ascertain when we ask questions about capacity, and then what the various roles and responsibilities are that we might have as professionals or as community members in terms of understanding opportunities with regard to decision-making and support. I also want to talk a little bit about challenges that might arise for you specifically in your work. And to that end, I've had some wonderful questions submitted on that subject with regard to the challenges of application. I have a colleague at the Elder Justice Center who said, make sure that you talk about the challenges of application in terms of capacity assessment tools. So I'll use some of the submitted questions to explore those issues. I do want to make a few special acknowledgements here. I'm really in debt to the National Center on Law and Elder Rights, as well as the American Bar Association's Commission on Law and Aging in helping me to form my own thinking about these subjects. I have linked here in the slides, which you will receive a copy of, some available resources. This is just scratching the surface of the resources that are available via these organizations. But I just wanted to point those out and give a special thank you to the National Center on Law and Elder Rights, as well as the Commission on Law and Aging. So now I want to talk a bit about autonomy, capacity, and consent. I'm interested in particular for us as professionals, often in the instances that we face around questions of capacity. I'm kind of interested in this: who wants to know and why do they want to know? This is kind of a baseline question, I think, when we're thinking about the questions around concepts and capacity in the context of our work. Who wants to know? Why do they want to know? In general, when we think about capacity, we think about the ability to do something. It's ability or power, capability, capacity. We can see the coordination there. Capacity is the ability or power to do or feel or think something at a particular moment in time. So you'll hear me talk a lot about this over the course of the presentation, but when we think about capacity, our primary question is capacity to do what? We need to understand what we are asking about. And that's a very preliminary aspect of our inquiry, because capacity referenced alone only describes an ability, blankly, an ability at a particular moment in time. Capacity to avoid coughing during this quiet moment of the concert. You know, I think about that, a particular moment in time. Capacity to understand and laugh at the joke at this comedy show. Capacity to make an elaborate gourmet meal. We're talking about an empty set. So I'll go on to talk a little bit more about that, but we're talking about abilities at particular moments in time. So what are we asking about that somebody may be interested in doing? I do want to talk too about the kind of milieu of language around capacity by offering this observation related to capacity and competency, and that we have historically attempted to make distinctions between these concepts kind of generally, or to some extent perhaps kind of academically or theoretically. We want to make distinctions between capacity and competency, and have said, you know, we think about capacity again as this empty set. We have to define what it is that we're asking about, but by itself, we're just recognizing it as the power, ability to make decisions, understand, think, feel, do a thing. The competency, in contrast, is a legal determination or a finding made by a court. So this is how we have spoken about it. And really, we find, in fact, that courts are increasingly using the language of capacity. And perhaps even more importantly than this distinction about how, you know, lawyers or academicians or courts have approached this terminology, we have to understand that our participants, clients, residents, the folks who are engaging with us as professionals, in response to questions about capacity, they are using this language interchangeably. They talk about competency, they talk about capacity. They are not making distinctions between sort of nuanced historical terminology or trends in terminology. So that's an observation that I want to make about this language. So, sometimes people will ask, well, what's the difference between capacity and competency? And I really do think it's a historical distinction. I don't think that it's particularly relevant now because, again, we find courts using the language of capacity fairly routinely. And then I will also observe, given that, that then we're also aware that there's a movement away from the language of capacity, perhaps for many of these reasons that we'll be here together discussing today, but that there is a great deal of confusion around that language and some recognition that perhaps our preoccupation with capacity and that concept is misplaced in some sense, and that what we really ought to be looking at are in fact the specific and individual things that a person can do relevant to the questions that we're asking about what or whether they can do them. So the idea is that the capacity is kind of coming into question, that there's some I think the concepts of capacity, I think, are coming into question legitimately by people who examine these issues and who want to understand more deeply how individuals respond to support upon requests for help, whether that's in decision-making or in other aspects of practical life. But the example that I'll offer of this is that in our uniform guardianship, conservatorship, and other protective acts, uniform law, which is the Commission on Uniform Laws offers standardized legal language to state legislatures for their perusal and potential adoption into law. So it gives us a general sense sometimes for the trajectory of law. But the Uniform Act on guardianship and conservatorship no longer uses the language of capacity at all. The word does not appear in that uniform law. Instead, that uniform law asks courts to look at the basis for ordering that a person be subject to guardianship or conservatorship, and that basis includes supported decision-making and other forms of support. But you'll not find the word capacity in that uniform act. So that's just an observation I want to make about the trajectory of this language. My goal is to support all of you who are focused on empowerment towards safety. This is my goal in our conversation today. And I know, based on the excellent questions that I received, that many, if not most of you, are working really diligently towards empowerment and safety. When we see participants in our programs and services as subjects to empower in terms of capacity and in terms of decision making, in terms of taking practical daily actions in their lives, we seek to recognize capacity where it exists. We want to know, what is a person able to do? What can we talk about a person? What can we talk about a person doing successfully? What can we talk about in terms of supports in order to meet that person's ability to successfully accomplish their objectives? So we're going to start by recognizing capacity where it exists, and it exists for most people in many ways. And so we want to use all of the tools and impressions that are available to us. Those are things like our knowledge of our participants, the folks we're serving, our ability to engage with them in various ways, information that they make available to us about their circumstances that might come from other people. So there are all kinds of tools and impressions that we can use to form a recognition of capacity where it exists. And then we could also support individual agency. So rather than curtail that, we can seek to establish it or build upon it if we are working with clients who have that opportunity to to reclaim or to be supported in assertions of their own capacity for decision making about various aspects of their lives. It's a valuable practice to consider the abilities of the folks that we're serving, of course, because we know that global capacity declarations are not particularly useful to us. These concepts here on the slide, we know capacity is not either or all or nothing. It's not the same for every person. And here I'm kind of breaking my own rules. Say I'm already talking about capacity in sort of a general way, but when we're talking in general about the term, if we haven't specified, we still know decision making can look different for the same people at different times. We want to think of capacity focused on various subjects as a continuum. But as we've said, inquiries about capacity should focus on what an individual can do successfully, and thereby kind of identify or narrow to questions about where a person may need additional support. So a person may have capacity to do one thing and not another thing, and that's an acceptable circumstance. But therefore, it's not particularly useful when we say that globally a person is incapacitated, right? This doesn't really reflect the reality of people's circumstances or the wide range of things that people are either able or unable to do, feel, think, or understand. So I think we want to focus on what people can do, and that's our opportunity here to recognize that those varying degrees, or to recognize that continuum that I spoke about. There was an excellent question that was submitted that asked for an example of a situation in which a person might have diminished capacity and still, so diminished decisional capacity, and still have legal contractual capacity. And this is to this point here in which a person may have the capacity to do one thing but not another. And it's an astute question. I'm going to talk about it, but I want to first introduce what I mean when I'm talking about concepts like contractual capacity. So here's where we'll talk a bit about what some examples might be, or some circumstances might be in which a person has capacity to do something but not something else. Again, calling into question this idea that we can ever assess a person's total or global capacity. It refers back to the fact that varying degrees of capacity are required for various purposes, right? One form of capacity, or even a way we might characterize it as a level of capacity, might be required for a certain personal objective. One level of capacity is required for certain legal responsibilities, and those standards are set in the law. So there are different kinds of, or different levels of intricacy in our decision making, and that's reflected in the varying degrees of capacity that are required to accomplish different things. And in addition to there being multiple purposes for asking questions about concepts and capacity, there are also multiple roles within this kind of system of questioning capacity. So I spoke about standards that are established in state law that create certain standards of capacity for the accomplishment of legal tasks. These are things like consenting to medical treatment, consenting to sex, making testamentary documents, wills, or trusts that do something with our assets after we die, or entering into various forms of contracts. These are all kind of questions that have, under certain circumstances, legal answers that are set in state statutes. And then when those legal questions arise, clinicians can provide evidence on capacity, and that evidence is provided to lawyers, it maybe is provided to courts, or it might be provided to other people. Clinicians can provide information or reflection on capacity to do certain tasks to others. So clinicians are offering that evidence in reflection, sometimes maybe even to family members who are inquiring. And then courts, the role of the court is to, under some circumstances, make a determination about the validity of a contract or agreement of some kind, or to make a determination about the rights of respondents in guardianship matters. And the evidence that courts are using is evidence that's presented, such as clinical evidence of certain forms of capacity. So this is kind of the information flow when we're talking about, when we're talking about concepts and capacity. We talk about decisional capacity and legal capacity and medical capacity and all these concepts, but I want you to sort of we're starting to form a shape of the language. Again, underlying all of these distinctions is this idea then that we have to specify capacity for what specifically. When we do talk about legal capacity, and I am talking a bit about legal capacity today because, not just because that's my kind of professional frame of reference, but also because that's a frame in which this sort of discussion lands in our collective laps, if you will. Legal capacity is the ability to give informed consent, really to understand risks and benefits, and to make a voluntary decision. So we see here, consent is informed when a person understands, knows about options, understands the risks and benefits of those options, chooses, and then has an understanding of the outcome of the choice. So this is what we're looking for when we're thinking about whether or not a person meets a legal standard for capacity. And those legal standards of capacity are here. Some examples: contractual, understands the contents of a contract. A testamentary standard for capacity means understanding what I own, who would normally be the recipient of the things that I own when I die, and if I make a big change to that, what the outcome of that change will be. So here you can see, again, reflecting sort of a knowledge of risks and alternatives and choices. But again, there are a lot of standards here in play. And so we have to, again, specify capacity specifically to do what, who's asking, and why. Is it a determination that rests on the fulcrum of a legal standard? In that case, we are looking very specifically at language in the law, and language that's very specific depending on where you are and the question that you're asking. Here's where I want to share this resource from the American Bar Association. This is being from the American Bar Association is directed to lawyers and is specifically speaking to determinations around legal capacity. But I do think that these are such excellent commandments that I wanted to share them with everybody today. I think they are incredibly useful when we think about these concepts, and they are presenting this discussion in a way that I think transcends our inquiries in exclusively this sort of legal realm. Again, we've spoken about this already, and my great gratitude and confidence to you in your service that you are doing these things, presuming capacity. I know that's the case. Again, I know it because of the questions that I received today. For all of us, not just the lawyers among us, talking to the client or participants alone, away from the influence of other individuals if possible. This may be possible, it may not. Maximizing client abilities. Again, gratitude to those on the call today, on the webinar today, who are so diligently doing that in their own work with and on behalf of people who may need certain forms of support. Here is one that I think reflects what we were just talking about. Thou shalt not worship any one standard for capacity. Again, because there is no single standard for capacity. It entirely depends on what we are asking about what we are asking about. I'm getting lost in all of my own prepositions. It's entirely dependent on this question. And so there is no single applicable standard for capacity. I think this is something that many of us in our moments of greatest frustration sort of wish there were. And I will admit to spending time in my own career sort of thinking that there was something I was missing here, that there must be some sort of single unified standard for capacity across the board that would help me to understand what kind of guidance I could give to clients. and a sort of general suspicion that I was missing something. I do still sometimes have that when I talk about these concepts, but the more that I look, and certainly, the more that we hear from experts in the field who have been examining these issues for so long, like Charles Sabatino and Erica Wood from the Bar Association, really seeing we do not have any single standard, and that does create complexity within our interpretive system. And to that point, there is no single standard, and the MME, the mini mental exam that is being referred to here, this may not be as impactful as it was even the few years ago that this article was written. I'll say anecdotally, I do not hear about it being used as a sort of be-all end-all in the way that I had in the past. So I'm wondering about your own experiences, and in fact, if you have anything you'd like to share with the group on that subject, please feel free to weigh in the chat. I welcome that. Or if you have anything to report to us at Elder Justice Center, this is again one of the most extraordinary things about these webinars, and something I'm so grateful for. This is an aside, is just the ability to share information with such a devoted and committed group of peers who are here with the same or similar goals. And in any case, if you have reflections on the use of the mini mental status exam in your own work, I welcome hearing about those. Here's this assertion that I have been using far more words than necessary to try to describe, which appears amusingly in this "thou shalt" language, not end any query with only the word capacity. Yea, the proper query shall be capacity to do what? What are we talking about? What are we asking about? What specific type of decision? Is it a decision about what to eat? Is it a decision about what medications to take, or whether or not to proceed with a certain medical procedure? Is it a decision about where to live? And in that inquiry, we will gather the big picture. Here's our number 7, variability, intermittency, and nuance. This leads me to another theme that arises in this discussion for me routinely, which is that we're so challenged in professional life on this question, or on these questions about capacity, because one of the most effective answers to these questions for professionals is time, spending time with participants to understand their perspectives, to understand their communication style, the way they engage with the world around them. That's something that most of the professionals I know, I'm just going to say all of the professionals I know that are in service in this realm, that is the thing that they do not have, is time. Lots of extra time, or not even extra time, but the ability to devote time in the way that may in fact be required to develop a complete understanding of the way that a person thinks. And again, habitual standards of behavior, clients' goals and values. Failed to number Commandment 9 related to confidentiality and autonomy, even in the face of incapacity that a person who may be facing, for example, a diagnosis of a condition that may be a deteriorating condition, still has the ability to express their own decisions in all kinds of areas of life. So I just we know that, and that in fact, encouraging any kind of planning that ensures that a person's wishes are respected, using, in the case that is being referred to here by the Bar Association, using legal tools. So that's that final one. But I just share these because I do think they situate us together in these concepts in the way that I would hope, and in the way that I know is happening for many, many people who are in this work. So I also want to talk a little bit about medical capacity and informed consent, because this question often arises in our work when it comes to questions about whether or not a person can make decisions about their healthcare or treatment. And medical decision-making also requires informed consent. Does the person understand their situation? Do they know the consequences of their decision or appreciate those consequences? And then are they thinking through the options that are made available? Then another practical question here is, can the patient communicate or make their wishes known? That's another piece of this inquiry when we think about whether or not a person is appropriately weighing a medical decision or has the capacity to make a medical decision. But again, worship no single standard. So here we can think in general about what it takes to make a medical decision, but some of those decisions are much more complex than others. And why in particular are we concerned about this at the Elder Justice Center? And this is something that I will revisit in various ways, but we know that autonomy is a protective factor against abuse. So at the Minnesota Elder Justice Center, we're focused on responding to and preventing instances of abuse, neglect, or financial exploitation that are perpetrated against older or vulnerable adults. And the more engaged individuals are in decision-making about their lives, the safer they are. And here are a couple of studies that evaluate this. But when we just think practically, we can see why this is. People are engaged in a risk-benefit analysis when they are acting autonomously, and therefore they are beginning with a greater awareness of potential risks than people who are having another individual make decisions for them are aware of. So that's kind of how this connects for me. And we do feel it's incredibly important, I think, to support individual autonomy in that effort toward safety. So we've talked about the continuum of capacity. People have different capacities for different things. And of course, we know that it can fluctuate fairly significantly for people, even in their own lives, based on all of these possible considerations and variables: time of day, the medication a person is taking, and then also that a person's experiences are relevant to their capacity. Their educational experiences may be relevant, particularly when we think about literacy and language, when information is presented in writing, or when information is presented in another language, or when it's presented in translation in various forms. So all of these are germane to an inquiry about whether or not a person is understanding what's being presented to them. And so we know, therefore, that our reflection on another person's capacity may be impacted by the presence for that other person of these various, and this is just a few of examples of variables that can impact. I think, say, for example, about what we know about tired driving. This is a situation where under normal circumstances in which a person is not tired, they are a perfectly safe driver, and that a person who becomes tired is less and less safe. I mean, and these are significant. This is a significant fluctuation in capacity for one individual over a fairly limited amount of time. And this is just one example of an instance in which we can see those adverse effects of capacity. I also do want to make a few distinctions here about these 3 Ds, the concerns about delirium, dementia, and depression. These circumstances which might have impacts on either a person's decision-making or my impression of a person's decision-making. So in brief, I want to talk about some distinctions between these. Dementia is a term that we use to describe specific disorders that cause significant decline in cognitive functioning, and it's identifiable, and it's not a normal part of aging. So the presence of dementia is not something that we should expect for all aging persons. It's different from cognitive lapses or forgetfulness, or from delirium and depression, which can result out of other circumstances, which I'll talk a little bit about. But when we think about dementia, you'll often hear these forms of illness referred to as Alzheimer's disease or Alzheimer's type dementias, but we know there are many different types of dementia that are diagnosable. And so again, just highlighting the difference between dementia, again, a term that describes a range of disorders that may affect the brain, and that may affect areas of cognitive function, but also, again, different from other impositions on decision-making. There was an excellent question in which a person inquired about, really, and I'll characterize it as a rhetorical question. I don't know if that was, in fact, the question asker's intent exactly, but it was a wonderful question about why is my forgetfulness as a person in middle age treated differently than my parents' forgetfulness as an older adult. And it's a very good question. It's a very good question. We all can have cognitive lapses or forgetfulness. So why would we treat forgetfulness in a person in middle age differently than we would treat that same kind of forgetfulness? Well, I mean, in part, it's because, again, we know about issues like dementia, and we want to be sensitive to that. But we also know that dementia can impact people regardless of age. So, not regardless of age, but across a wide spectrum of ages. Dementia versus delirium. Delirium is a reversible condition. We often think about dementia as a condition that will progress, whereas delirium, which also creates can create or impact cognitive function, can result out of other underlying issues. I think here we have examples of illness or infection. I think one that is really recognizable to a lot of people is delirium that results out of UTIs. This is a common example that I can think of in which this can be an outcome. Intoxication, sort of medication use, or interactions can result in delirium, and they can co-occur. A person can experience delirium and also have dementia diagnosis. The delirium can be profound and the dementia can be mild. This is a thing that can happen. Regardless, we would identify delirium as being reversible because it is a symptom of an underlying issue. And so when the underlying issue becomes resolved, a person may be able to then return to a prior level of cognitive functioning if the questions we're asking are about decision-making. And depression, which can also manifest with cognitive impacts. For those of us who are working with older or with vulnerable adults, we can see how significant this may be when we look at some of the events that a person might experience that would result in depression. For most of us that are serving individuals in this context, we know that people have experienced many of these things and are at risk for experiencing these things. That circumstance itself can be depressing. We also, again, know, in contrast, depression is treatable and that people can receive treatment for depression and return to prior levels of decision-making or cognitive functioning. So again, when we think about depression, this is an experience that's distinct from dementia, but may present with similar impacts to cognition. This leads me to this discussion about assessment. Because when we think about those dementia, delirium, depression, those really require a clinician's assessment to identify whether or not those things are taking place. So this question about what is the utility then, and when and who performs a capacity assessment. And I just want to start in the spirit of our introduction by sharing that capacity assessment is just a natural part of social interaction. I am always interested in whether my conversation partner is tracking with me or is attending to what I'm saying. It happens every time I interact. I kind of wonder if the person I'm talking to is on their phone or looking at looking at their phone. um, are they are they do they have the capacity in this moment to attend to what I am saying? The answer might be no. Their attention is directed elsewhere. But it happens anyway in all of our interactions, and there is no straightforward or simple test. And there's some danger in what we might think of as straightforward tests, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But again, when we do this kind of assessment, like, oh, is the person I'm communicating with, engaging with me on the same level? We're looking at the totality of the circumstances. Are we in a loud place? Can this person hear me? And again, I'm talking about, like, maybe I meet a friend at a restaurant. I want to know if they're following what I'm communicating about. So I'm watching all these things. Oh, must be difficult to hear in this room. Let's move elsewhere. I mean, we're always engaged in this process. So I think this is another area where I used to feel a great deal of confusion, so whose assessment is the ultimate assessment? Who gets the final say, or whose word is the final authority? And again, we go back to this question about capacity for what? Is this a legal question in which a court is going to have some final authority? Is it a practical question where we really need to answer, like, does a person have the capacity to operate a motor vehicle? Is it a is it a question about the other activities of daily life, or making those distinctions? We have to specify that as we are thinking about that question, totality of circumstances. So the issue there with these screening tools and various assessment screens for various purposes is that they can be very situational and fairly limited. Excuse me, I'm going to sneeze. My apologies. So assessment screening tools may be asking questions about a particular form of capacity to do something specific, but then the outcome of the screening tool may be attempted to be used more broadly, or people may refer to the outcome of a screening tool that's specific to one form of decision making or one type of activity, and may overinterpret those outcomes to apply more broadly to a person's life circumstances. Oftentimes these assessment screenings require special training in order to correctly administer. So it's not maybe a situation where we can necessarily find something online and deliver it without understanding more detail about the ideal circumstances for those questions to be posed, or what kinds of answers are appropriate, and how to record and compare those answers. And then we also know that many of these assessment screening tools take a particular perspective, and generally they're going to take the perspective of dominant culture. They will reflect what dominant culture believes is an appropriate decisional standard, and a correct set of techniques for communicating that decision. So we know that that doesn't reflect the experience of every person. So we have some deep concerns about the use of assessment screening tools outside of very, frankly, limited and specific contexts, such as screens that are administered by medical professionals that are focused on ascertaining a specific a capacity for a very, very specific, and I'll say specified, called out in the tool purpose. But otherwise, kind of global assertions about a person's capacity, even when they are provided by a licensed professional, hold only limited meaning in reality. Unfortunately, in our experience, they tend to hold meaning in other contexts, such as courts, because of deference paid to medical professionals in those contexts. And that's appropriate because we want medical professionals to be interpreting medical information. And nonetheless, that can be highly persuasive. And so I just want to call this out for those of us who are in a position to be vigilant about that, whether we're providing assessments or whether we are interpreting them or requesting them on behalf of our participants, clients, members, or residents. That these are tools that may perpetuate implicit bias. In order to use these, again, specific and limited assessments, even to use those types of assessment tools safely, these are some general recommendations that they are consistent and applied consistently and systematically. That they, again, are gathering the same information for every individual, that in fact they may rely even on standardized templates. And again, you can see here, this, I feel like even recognizing this as a best practice feels uncomfortable, right? Because we're talking about individual decision making, and what I'm really advocating for is individual, an understanding of individual circumstances. Again, incorporating all of the variables and nuance about that individual's life. So a standardized template speaks only in a limited way to the wide range of information that could be available to us about a person's decision making and circumstances. And here's exactly where we kind of come into the challenges of application when we think about understanding capacity and or assessing capacity in various ways, whether we're using screening tools or whether we are using our own impressions and trying to kind of result or affect a more comprehensive understanding of a person's circumstances at a particular moment in time. But our most significant resource here is time spent both in conversation with a person or engaged with a person about whom we may need to make a determination as to decision making on a particular subject, or time gathering information about a person's circumstances if in their instance they may not be able to engage us, or we may be seeking additional information. It takes time. I don't have an answer for that. I wonder if anybody else has an answer for that. It's time consuming, and it takes a great deal of time to build the information that we actually need to understand how best to support people. I struggle with that because I understand how limited this resource is for really, again, most folks on the webinar today, and that also that this resource, that the resource of time to do this work, that resource is so limited is a source of tremendous stress for a lot of the professionals who are on the webinar today. So I want to acknowledge that the thing that I'm asking us for is a thing that we don't necessarily have to give. And yet, I think there are things that we could do as we build towards this understanding that decisional capacity is incredibly nuanced, but that therefore there are tremendous and multiple opportunities for us to support a person in decision making. But again, when we're thinking about how a person is communicating, when we're inquiring for ourselves in these moments, taking time to engage with somebody, when we're actually engaging with a person about whom there may be a question related to a decisional capacity or capacity to take a particular action, that we are thinking about these things in those moments, the way they're expressing short-term memory, the choices they make in communication. I'll talk a little bit about lability, that they are affirming the things that we're communicating, and the extent to which a person is able to affirm those things. If a person is able to be flexible and adaptable, again, about sort of changing circumstances, or carry kind of an understanding of, risks associated with one course of action, and different risks associated potentially with a different course of action, risks or benefits. So these are some of the observations that we might make in those conversations if we have the time to engage in this way. We are often asked questions at Elder Justice Center about assessment for financial decision making. I got a great question about really just the questions about maybe making healthcare decisions versus questions about making financial decisions. Um, and and so I don't, well, I would say sort of we're talking about a couple of different realms when we talk sometimes about financial decision making. We may be talking about, is a person actually able to enter into a contract? And for contractual capacity, we have a legal standard. We might be asking instead, does a person have capacity to manage a checking account? In that case, we might be observing for the way that a person responds to requests to do the math that's required in order to manage that. And then again, when we're thinking about a continuum here, I may be, this is probably a good example for me to use myself as an example, but I may have the ability to manage a checkbook ledger, but some of these other computations I'm not particularly interested in managing. So just some impressions that we might form when we're thinking about financial decision making in particular. And then as to behavior, is a person quiet or talkative? Are they expressing distress? What are some of other observations that we can make about what a person how a person is communicating or presenting in a conversation? And then also observations from others. Here's where the time-consuming process of gathering additional information may come into play for those of us that are in a position to try to make a determination about whether someone can give an instruction or make a decision or requires a particular kind of support in order to do so. And of course, there are many ways, even with limitations on time, that we can accommodate cognitive impairment, or where we can accommodate expressions that might differ from what we would expect, even if we don't know that a person may be cognitively impaired. But a way to accommodate a person who communicates differently, a way to accommodate a person who expresses a desire to be accommodated differently. So some considerations that we could make in terms of really meeting folks, even physically, where they would like to meet. What's the most comfortable place for a person to express themselves, public or quiet, pace, tone, casual or formal, how much time do I have? Again, here's the time thing. Do I have to devote to this conversation? Have I offered information enough times for it to sink in? I mean, a fair question from something for me when I think about some of these conversations, how long it takes sometimes for information to sink in. So again, how are we accommodating our participants? And then how are we characterizing our own levels of concern if they appear? Because again, our primary focus is on what a person is able to do and what support they need in order to accomplish those things. So that's our main focus. If we do have a concern, that we are reflecting that and that we're documenting that reflection. So if we have a concern about the way that somebody makes a decision, that we're making a note of that for our own reference and the reference of anyone else should we need it. I'm close to concluding, but I do want to talk about supported decision making and point at this as a tool that is critical in our understanding of how to support autonomy where it exists. Something, again, that we consider very important in establishing safety. At the Elder Justice Center. Supported decision-making is an approach that simply does that looks to understand what a person is able to do and support a person in accomplishing what they're able with identified supporters who are able to help in specific ways. So I have some additional information about supported decision-making here, and I just want to encourage you to, if you have more questions or interest, reach out to the Center for Excellence in Supported Decision-Making or review some of the webinars that the Center for Excellence in Supported Decision-Making has presented for us at the Elder Justice Center. I would welcome that as well. And here's some information additionally about how to reach the Center for Excellence in Supported Decision-Making, or WINGS Minnesota, which is another group that does discuss and explore supported decision-making. A few local and national resources that can include here in which other additional discussion of capacity may be found, and connections between assessment of capacity, aging, and safety issues. And then finally, my contact information. I am tremendously grateful again to everybody who joined us this afternoon. I'm really honored to be able to spend time talking with you about this concept. I recognize it was a lot of information compressed into a tight time frame. I hope it was, as an introduction, useful to situate us all in a state of reflection on the utility of this concept in our work.
Thank you, Mara. It was like really a nice active chat as well. I appreciate that. There were people kind of providing sort of reiteration of what you're saying. The example of like, if you don't have your hearing aids in, your capacity is, you know, to hear and understand might be reduced. Language barriers, those things are very important. Appreciate that others shared some resources within the chat. We had one Q&A, and I think we can kind of, I know it's 1 o'clock, people are jumping off, but it is a specific thing about POA and healthcare directives that it says that from, and I think there's some clarification you could provide. My understanding over the years as a medical social worker is that if we have a healthcare directive of a power of attorney that states that it will stand if the person is no longer able to make their own decision as deemed by a couple of providers, then the POA or healthcare directive comes into effect and does not need to be reviewed by a court or to make a legal determination unless it's being contested.
That's correct. So that's exactly this person, the question as articulated is accurate. So that kind of brings me back to that kind of question about, again, who is asking and why? Is it because the action of the agent is being contested? If so, then a court may be interested in, you know, in the evidence presented by the attending physician who made a determination about capacity. So that's kind of how that flow would work. The healthcare directive is a legal document with a legal decisional standard associated with it, and so that would kind of be how that flow works. So the person posing the question is accurate in their identification of that.
Well, there's a ton of kudos to you and thanks for the webinar in our chat, and I thank you all. I will be sending out the PowerPoint with the CEU as indicated. There was a lot of love for the 10 ABA commandments.
So good, so good. Thank you again. Call out Chuck Sabatino, Charles Sabatino, and Erica Wood at the American Bar Association Commission on Law and Aging created that, and it's one of many. Well, no, not many, but at least a couple of lists or commandment articles that I have found incredibly helpful from the American Bar Association.
And then I would also just, there's one more point I'm going to make on this, like the supported decision-making piece. We do have December 2 webinars that they are going to be putting on in that area. So there's an upcoming opportunity to kind of dig into that supported decision-making again. Next week, we will have a webinar. I have to always remind myself of what the plan is. And so we have folks from Friends and
Friends and
Company to
Co.
talk about social connection and how that is a preventative factor as well. And then at the end of the month, we'll talk about cultural sensitivity from the National, I don't always say this, but it's the Indigenous Elder Resource Center. And NEIJC, whatever that acronym can mean, I know is works there.
I got it. National
But I thank
Indigenous
you all.
Elder Justice Initiative. That's
Thank you. It's some of these our names can be so long, and to get them right can be a challenge. I'm sorry about that. I will hopefully see you all next week, but look forward to an email from me, and this recording will go up before the week is out. Okay. Have a great week and talk to you soon.